Hello and welcome to The Green Room by Deloitte, a podcast where we ask the tricky questions about the world around us. I'm Lizzie Elston and you're listening to episode 26, where we ask, will travel ever be the same again? Well, hello, and thank you so much for downloading this episode of The Green Room. You will notice that this is not George's voice. George isn't around today, so the pod squad here have decided that they could trust Ethan and myself with this episode. Hey, Ethan, how are you doing?
Yeah, good, thanks, Lizzie. Really enjoyed getting an opportunity to daydream about travelling abroad this week. Absolutely. How about yourself?
Yeah, same. I mean, you sort of see the title of this episode, will travel ever be the same again? And I hope that by the end of this, we can answer to some sort of yes. I think this week's question is one we'd all like to know the answer to. And we've all, I'm sure, had reason to have to cancel or postpone holidays this year during lockdown. We couldn't even catch up with family and friends, let alone jump on a plane abroad. But clearly there are some positives in that I know I've got to know my local area a lot better, and clearly there'll have been an impact on the environment, which will be positive. Any plans of yours scuppered this year, Ethan?
Yeah, so I had a big trip planned to India for a month, and just missed out on that. Just got the news that we couldn't go, which is pretty devastating. But at least we weren't stuck out there. Oh
golly, yeah, absolutely. No, it's I'm sure you're not alone. Well, thankfully, you and I don't have to answer this question alone, and we've got some guests to help us. Who's in the green room today?
So today, Lizzie, we're joined by Andreas Scriven. Andreas is head of hospitality and leisure at Deloitte UK. He has extensive consultancy and M&A experience across the UK, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, and the US. He works with many of the leading global brands and operators. Hi, Andreas.
Good morning. Glad to be with you.
Good morning. And we're also joined by Ian Taylor. Ian is executive editor of Travel Weekly. He reports sector-wide on aviation, leisure and corporate travel, inbound and outbound, and moderates many events. He is a career journalist who has worked in travel for most of the last 20 years. Hi, Ian.
Morning. Hi.
And what usually happens now is you get an icebreaker question. Okay, I thought it was going to be something about holidays, but it's a bit more random. If you're an ice cream flavour, which one would you be?
That's a tricky one. See, I'd go slightly exotic and go dulce de leche, which is, where I grew up was just called caramel. But I'd probably pick that.
Very fancy. Like the finer things in life, do you, Andreas?
When they're available, yeah, as we all do probably.
What about you, Ian?
Well, by choice, I'd be vanilla, which is probably a boring answer, but it would be terrific, high-class vanilla, but I can't eat ice cream, so I'd have to be a lemon sorbet.
Oh, okay, there you go.
Ian, I am with you that vanilla is underrated, and us vanilla likers get really bad press.
Well, I don't know. I've had any bad press over it, but I'm caramel and all sorts of things do nothing for me. Chocolate's disgusting in ice cream.
It's a very controversial conversation. So I'm going to try and be clever in my answer. I'm going to say Rocky Road, because, you've kind of got a mixture. You've got sort of the rough with the smooth. I don't know what I'm talking about, really. I am rough with smooth, but maybe a variety of options within a Rocky Road. I don't know. Ethan, help me. What would you be?
Similar, I think. Going to mix it up with rum and raisin. Get the
Good
fun
choice.
stuff and the sweet stuff at the same time.
Right. Well, I'm very glad that the rest of the podcast is not talking about whether we would be different ice cream flavours, because that one had me very stumped. But what we do want to talk about today is obviously the future of travel, and it's been a difficult time. Clearly, people haven't been able to travel for personal reasons. Obviously, corporates haven't been able to allow people to do business travel. And there are clearly a huge impact not only on the airlines but also on hotels. And we're seeing lots in the press, obviously, about those going into distress. Let's maybe start off by just thinking a bit about travel. And Andreas and Ian, it'd be interesting to hear. I think Ethan and I have both had travel plans scuppered this year. Is that the same for both of you? Andreas, shall I go to you first?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I have had travel plans scuppered on a couple of occasions. So very early on, for Easter break, I was supposed to go out to the Middle East with my daughter and enjoy a bit of sun and sand, which felt much needed after the dark winter months, and that got cancelled, and I went through the whole joys of having to apply for a voucher and wonder if I was ever going to get it and how I was going to be able to use it and so on. And then my summer holiday got cancelled, where I was due to go to the islands of Sao Tome and Principe, just off the west coast of Africa, also known as the African Galapagos, and that got cancelled as well for very obvious reasons. So I've suffered with that, like I think most of us have, but I think positively, I've rebooked a number of staycations, as many of us did over the summer, and got to see some of the English and Scottish countryside that I've seen before, some I haven't. So it's been fantastic in that regard.
That's wonderful.
And in terms of I guess an anecdote of where travel has gone wrong for me, it's a continual theme. So I used to pre-pandemic travel a lot and obviously stay in a lot of different hotels. And my ongoing pet peeve about hotels are light switches, believe it or not. Right. So every time you're in a hotel room, you never know which light switch actually turns off all the lights. And it seems like such a simple thing, but how many times have I, been in bed wondering how I turn off all the lights in the room, and there's 7 switches and no clear label on it. So over time, that's something that I hope to influence and change in the industry. Lofty goals, I know.
Hotel owners, are you listening? You heard it here.
Correct.
What about you, Ian? How's your year been?
Sorry, I've just got to come in on the light switch thing. It's the bane of my life. You turn up in the early hours of the morning somewhere and they're on the phone or something, or they've given you an iPad for the lights. And the number of times I've, after sort of 20 minutes of frustration, called down to reception and said, how do I turn the bloody lights off? I couldn't. I wish I had £1 for every time. What travel plans scrapped? Yes, I mean, several trips away. One of the most upsetting, actually, I was due to spend Easter in Cornwall, and that had to be cancelled. So, that wasn't overseas travel, but I've had several trips away cancelled and umpteen work trips. The most recent, I was supposed to be in Portugal today, tomorrow and Friday, and that was cancelled just last week, actually. So it couldn't have been, in the current circumstances, that's pretty short notice. So yes, but I've had wonderful breaks in Suffolk, in Northumbria, in Dorset. The beaches are unparalleled. So I've had a wonderful time in any case. An experience less positive. Yes, I was returning from a work trip to Rome on a well-known Italian airline, and not just soon after we unfastened our seatbelts, the cabin crew were coming round with drinks, and the person in the window seat next to me had a tomato juice, and the cabin crew member slung it down me.
Oh no.
So I was covered in tomato juice, and about 20 minutes later, there was a cabin crew were running up and down the aircraft, and I sort of peered over across the person sitting next to me through the window, and we were flying very close to the ground, which was odd because we were flying across France. And then they made an announcement saying we'd been diverted to Paris because we've got to make an unscheduled stop. And when we were landing, there were fire engines everywhere. And that's a bit odd. I wonder, there must have been a problem with the flight. And then as we trundled along the runway, they all started following us. And the aircraft came to a stop, and the doors opened, and all these firefighters came on. There was a fire in the cockpit.
Oh, no.
So that was a lucky escape. But I had to overnight in Paris in clothes covered in tomato juice, and fly back the following morning.
Yeah,
that sounds more stressful than light switches, I must say.
Not ideal.
Not sure I do want to go on a travel trip anytime soon after that tale.
Mm.
But so with COVID-19 and all the everything that's going on, and of course there's other things around the corner like Brexit, it must be an incredible time to be working in travel and travel reporting. How has it been like for you, Ian?
frantically busy. I've never been so busy in my life. We had to deal with, as a business, we had to deal with all the issues that everyone else did. So colleagues were furloughed and so on. So we've got a smaller team than normal, covering more news than you can imagine, because every business has constantly got announcements. There's constantly new restrictions, new work practices to adjust to. And so the volume of material is enormous, and we have fewer people to deal with it. So we've continued to produce a weekly magazine, which we stopped printing while people weren't in their workplaces, because it's delivered to people at work chiefly, not solely. But we resumed a weekly print publication in August, but at the same time we're producing twice daily digital news alerts at 9 and 5 or 6 in the evening. So the volume of stuff, working weekends, 11-hour days, is it's been interesting but taxing.
Yeah, and I have to confess, I did have a look at your author page before this interview, and I couldn't believe the amount of articles that you produced in one day.
I've got an algorithm doing it.
What about you, Andreas? I mean, you must be having some interesting conversations at the moment with others in the travel industry. What are some of the things that you're hearing? It must be very, very difficult at times.
Yeah, I think if I used one word to describe it, it's unpredictable. I think, the frequency of change, the lack of clarity, the speed of change, the severity of impact, the scale of the impact on the industry. And I think, one of the really interesting things is that we obviously subsegment the industry into, aviation, hospitality, leisure, all these different parts. But what this has really shown is how interconnected everything is and how dependent all of these different parts are on each other. And so I think, there's been that, just lack of clarity of what happens next. And that's certainly, the question I get asked most is, how long is this going to last? When's it going to be over? And of course, I then have to get out my crystal ball, just like everybody else, because, it's hard to predict what's going to happen next week, next month, and so on. So there's, real pressure, especially on the individuals, running hotels, running other hospitality and leisure businesses to forecast and plan for the future in what are, most challenging times.
But if you were to get out that crystal ball for us today, what would be your view of what the future might look like in, say, 6 months or a year from now?
So I think interestingly, we've run a survey throughout the pandemic, asking different stakeholders in the industry as to when they see the disruption from COVID-19 ending, and when they expect a return to kind of a normalized trading environment. And unfortunately, as we've done that survey through the pandemic, the answer to that has kept on moving out. And so, an expectation around disruption ending, certainly not before the end of next year, more likely going into 2022, and then normalized trading, the vast majority of people think at the earliest end of 2022, more likely going into 2023. So I don't know if that's a factor of it's far enough away that we can say, okay, well, it will be better by then, and so on, but it's not something that's going to get fixed or recover within the next 2 or 3 months. This is going to be a long and slow and difficult recovery, unfortunately.
And if we take a step back from looking at the future, where was the industry at before the pandemic hit?
So it varies a little bit by country that you're looking at, by segment that you're looking at, but what we had seen is pretty strong recovery since the global financial crisis. A lot of markets doing quite well. Although what we had started to see is there've been quite a bit of cost inflation in 2019, a little bit of oversupply in some markets, and so you start seeing a little bit of pressure and certain behaviors that suggest that we were close to or at kind of a peak environment, and of course then as COVID hit, that bump then massively accelerated the downturn in trading, but not in any way that obviously anybody would have been able to predict.
I'd agree with a lot of that. On the when will things return? Obviously, it's going to be a lengthy recovery in terms of returning to any kind of normality. But I'm pretty convinced that there will be travel next spring and summer on the back of some sort of testing regime for travellers that the government is looking at now. There'll be rapid tests. There'll be pre-departure testing with tests on arrival in the other destination. For example, I suspect there'll be a corridor open to New York, Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, that will allow some transit traffic to develop and so on. So I am fairly convinced that around Easter, by Easter time, people will be able to travel to some of the normal Mediterranean destinations and a limited number of long-haul destinations that have the facilities to match those in the UK. And then the question is when there are vaccines, because it'll take vaccines to really release things.
I would echo that. And if we look at, the question around consumer behavior and how that's going to change, and may change travel and the whole travel journey, as it were, I think, one of the key things that needs to be addressed is that the guest, the consumer needs to feel safe at every stage of that journey. If one of those links breaks down, and that could be not feeling safe, getting in a car, being taken to the airport, that will have an impact. So, whilst an airline or a hotel operator can do everything in their control, they're still reliant and dependent on that whole customer journey feeling safe, because otherwise people simply won't travel. That being said, I think, I take some positives from what we saw during the summer months in terms of hotel performance and leisure travel, where I think there was a slightly stronger recovery than many expected. You look at some of the occupancy levels in hotels in Cornwall and in Brighton and all over the place, right? Where it illustrated that people still want to travel, they still want to get away. And I think very much over the last couple of decades, people don't see an annual holiday as a luxury. They see it as a right, and have gotten accustomed to that. But again, I agree that there's going to be a number of people who will still take some convincing that it's safe to travel. And we see that in our Deloitte consumer tracker, where currently only 25% of people in the UK feel safe to fly. It's much higher in hotels. It's 40% where they feel safe to stay in a hotel. And there's some clear reasons for that, right? Where I think people feel they can control their interactions more in a hotel environment, and so on. But, there's still a long way to go to get that confidence back up for the vast majority of people to travel. And, I would agree that testing and a vaccine solution are absolutely critical to getting back to anywhere close to the levels that we've seen pre-pandemic.
Just on the point that Andreas was making previously about the recovery from the global financial crisis, because that is the best crisis, if you like, the most useful crisis to make a comparison with. It took until 2015 for overseas leisure travel from the UK to come back to anything approaching what it was in 2007, 2008, following the financial crisis. And it was 2016 before numbers, never mind value, numbers recovered of taking holidays, recovered to the level of 2007, 2008. So that could be the sort of length of time we're talking about, because the world economy and people's living standards are going to be affected by the crisis, clearly. Corporate travel never came back. There were almost 9 million outbound overseas corporate trips from the UK in 2008, and in last year there was 6.4 million. It remains down by about 25% so it never came back. And I suspect there will be a similar impact on corporate travel from this crisis.
And presumably will be a permanent, lasting impact on business travel, do we think?
I think the expectation is certainly that we'll see change. I think we have to be very careful every time, that we're in a crisis, that we don't overreact, that we look at something and say it's permanently impaired just because we're right in the middle of it. But certainly there are likely to be some changes. I would describe them more as an evolution than a revolution. So, the use of video conferencing is now, I think, fair to say, mainstream. It's been predicted to be the killer of the corporate meeting for decades now. But this is, I think, the first real legitimate challenge to elements of corporate travel in terms of meetings. So I think there will be changes to the sector. I think, people will potentially think twice about whether they need to travel halfway around the world for a 6-hour board meeting if they can dial in over Zoom or whatever it may be. And so I think there will be a potential impact in that regard. But also we shouldn't, forget that the travel and hospitality sector, is innovative, and they will find new ways to use the space that they have. They will look for new ways to engage with their customers. So it's not a static situation where because one area is being impacted, there's nothing that you can do. I think as we talk about the industry currently, it's in many ways quite depressing because it's so heavily impacted. But if we take a step back and look at pre-pandemic, pretty much every single medium to long-term indicator for the industry was positive, right? And there's a lot of other industries that can't say that. And I think, from my side, there's a clear expectation that the sector will bounce back. It will evolve. Whereas some other industries will have a harder time. Not to pick on retail, for example, but there's a number of, bricks and mortar formats that are going to move online, and that will be the permanent end of that type of format. Whereas whilst, we expect to see some distress in the sector, I've not heard anybody say, they think that the travel and hospitality sector is permanently impaired or indefinitely impaired, which I think is quite different than some other industries.
Did you know at Deloitte we support social enterprises through our 5 Million Futures programme? Like Change Please. They use 100% of the profits from their award-winning coffee to help people experiencing homelessness. They offer training, employment and ongoing support with housing, finances and therapy. Why not sign up to the Change Please Coffee Club to receive weekly deliveries of coffee beans, or try out one of their blends? Just head to changeplease.org or check out the show notes. Now, back to our topic of the day.
You sort of said that it's not all doom and gloom, and I'm interested in what some of the airlines and the hospitality sector are doing around innovation. One of the things that I find fascinating is that airlines are offering flights to nowhere for those who need their fix of flying but are happy to end up in the same place that they started. Could you tell us a bit more about these flights to nowhere and why people want to do it?
Frankly, I find it ridiculous. Look, some people will pay to do that. There are 5 cruise ships in Germany operating in from northern Germany, not going anywhere, but doing short trips. People don't get off the ship, but they can enjoy the facilities. The number of passengers is capped at half what it would normally have been, and through the summer people have been delighted to do that, to use the swimming pool, the other facilities. I don't know what, and all the rest of it. It wouldn't be my idea of a holiday, but it's actually been very valuable because it's been a test bed, if you like, for the managing people, behaviour, the protocols and all the rest of it. And so the global cruise industry has been studying what's happening on these 5 TUI and Hapag-Lloyd cruise ships and developing the protocols that will allow cruising to return next year off the back of that. I think the flights to nowhere are a gimmick. I mean, look, airlines have been doing things like offering meals in their premium class, turning them into a restaurant, or selling the pajamas from upper class, and stuff like this. Well, somebody in the airline saying, look, we could make a few coppers this way or that way or whatever. But it's not going to become a phenomenon. I don't think.
No, and I think it also raises, some environmental concerns where it starts to get very difficult to justify a flight that, in essence, goes in a giant circle. And I think, but I think it goes back to that point that people are trying to be innovative. You can agree or disagree with those specific approaches, and there's another example that I can highlight in the Netherlands where most restaurants have been forced to close, except if you're a restaurant in a hotel. And then you're allowed to serve meals to your guests. And, I'm aware of one example at least where a innovative hotelier then took the decision to offer dinner and charge an extra 10 euros for a hotel room, right? So that basically allowed people from the local community to come in and for a 10 euro premium, have a dinner out. Again, you can question whether that's appropriate or not, and if it's kind of in line with how the rules are intended. I would argue not. But again, I think, people are trying to adapt, they're trying to evolve, and they're trying to survive in a very difficult environment.
Yeah, and you mentioned the environmental concerns, and we also spoke quite a lot about consumer confidence. And I guess even if that confidence returns, are there factors like the environment that might affect the uptake of travel in the future?
Yeah, I think it is moving up the agenda, both at the corporate and at the personal level, without a shadow of a doubt. And we see a lot of examples where we have discussions where people are looking to do the right thing, but it actually potentially still is contributing to the problem. And I'll give an example where a friend of mine, she does the kind of environmental auditing of festivals and went out to do this in Costa Rica, and the festival is very proud of its environmental credentials and so on, until she of course pointed out that yes, they were environmentally friendly from the time people walked through their gates, but the vast majority of people had flown in from the US and Europe and had a huge carbon footprint, right? So you're actually contributing to the issue versus solving the issue, and so I think there's still a lot to be figured out around how do we satisfy people's desire to see ever more exotic locations, go to destinations all across the world more frequently, but do that in a socially responsible way. And I think again there's some innovation around technology that will help with that, but there's clearly a friction point in terms of what people want in terms of experiences in their life versus the reality of the impact it has on the environment.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Absolutely. I mean, we do a piece of research annually amongst UK consumers, which we partner actually on a report with Deloitte, and ask people a series of questions, obviously about their holiday intentions and so on, but also about their attitude to sustainability and the impact of flying and so on. So we've been doing this since 2012. So last year we saw up to a 9-point increase in concern about the impact of flying year on year. So this is amongst people intending to take a holiday in the following year. So that sounds like a huge increase, and of course it is, and it's increased 14 points approximately since we first asked the question in 2012. But the proportion of people who are intending to fly on holiday, who say the environmental impact of flying is a concern, varies between 1 in 6 and 1 in 4, depending on age. So it's gone up a lot, but it's a minority of people, and they're still flying.
I think I would probably fall into that bracket as someone who's environmentally conscious but loves traveling, so potentially it might be more of a reduction rather than a complete stop, which might be something that's seen in the industry. I guess you mentioned, Andreas, about innovation. Is there anything that's emerging either from a technology perspective or from a kind of management perspective, like a carbon passport or anything like that?
in the context of, the environmental side of things, there has been the ability to through a lot of airlines and through that kind of whole travel and hospitality chain to offset your carbon footprint for the travel that you take, and that's been around for a while. But I think, to your point of saying, well, I'd still want to travel, and it's about reduction. I think, that's where the key push needs to come. I don't think it's realistic, and people won't, make wholesale change that just cuts off all of their travel. They've become too used to that, and enjoy it. And, I think the other point is there's also value to that, right? The cultural, integration and kind of the mobility of different ideas and so on. There's huge value to those type of things. But I think that, the reality is that it's all about a focus on reducing versus totally eliminating, which I don't see happening. So, has there been anything that's been totally revolutionary? No, I think it's small steps that help, and in hotels there's been a increased push around frequency of servicing rooms, the whole we won't wash your towels type of thing. There's been big initiatives around reducing the toiletries and those little mini plastic bottles, and we can say probably thank you to David Attenborough and his great TV shows that have contributed to an acceleration of awareness around that. I've got a 7-year-old daughter. She watches those programs with me, and anything that arrives in the house with excess plastic, I get told off for, right? And so I think there will be there is an increased awareness, but it's small step changes like that in terms of improving the environmental record for the industry.
And on business travel, it's always been a big part of businesses' carbon footprint, and it's certainly true for Deloitte too. And we've committed to achieving net zero carbon by 2030 through our World Climate Initiative. And a big part of this will be changing the way we travel for business. Do you see a lot of corporates making these explicit pledges around cutting carbon?
Look, I think the imperative to take serious action on the environment is only going to grow as the extreme climate events and so on become more and more obvious to more and more people and more devastating to governments and so on. So I think when we emerge from COVID, it will be into a growing climate crisis, and that will be even more obvious to people, and that's what we're going to be grappling with for the next couple of decades.
And I think just one kind of point to add to that, and I'll use the hotel industry as an example here. One of the questions I was asked at a talk I gave in Amsterdam last year was, well, how much more is somebody willing to pay for an environmentally friendly hotel room? And of course, very, very difficult to measure, but also from my perspective, it's looking at it through the wrong lens, that you're not actually looking to get a premium or protect a premium, or what is the risk of not doing it. I think the risk of not doing it is that you won't see your average hotel room price as an owner drop by £2 or £3. What will happen is that customer will just disappear. So it's pretty binary. If they are starting to make choices based on your environmental record and they're not happy with it, you won't incentivize them to stay by giving them a £5 discount. They will just disappear and you'll lose that overnight stay. So, I don't think we're at the stage yet where there's a huge number of people making that fundamental decision, but I think it's certainly factoring into a lot more decisions where if people, can look at a destination and there's 3 or 4 hotels that they'd be happy to stay at, and one stands out in terms of its environmental record, they will win. Right? Or for a lot of people, they will win, and it's a competitive advantage. And I think the other thing is, I agree with what Ian said, that a lot of the decisions are and have been economic. But if I look over the past 10, 15 years ago at every conference, there was a sustainability panel and talks and so on, and then those vanished as the global financial crisis hit. We're in the middle of a pandemic and we're still talking about it now. So I think there has been much more lasting impact in terms of environmental awareness in our industry over the last 15 years, and it's here to stay.
Interesting. And the other thing which was until the pandemic sort of number one, in the top few priority lists for many businesses and many of us as Brexit. Clearly, it hasn't gone away, but are people recognising that the effects of the pandemic are much worse than those of Brexit, and therefore less to worry about from a Brexit perspective? What are companies saying about that?
If I can come in on that for a second. Look, I think a lot of travel companies are concerned about Brexit. I think the airlines are largely comfortable with it. I mean, by and large, because the UK-based carriers have already taken measures. EasyJet now has businesses registered in the EU, so it can handle the whatever happens, really. But also the likelihood of air traffic being seriously negatively affected by Brexit are minimal, apart from queues at some EU borders. And I don't think destinations like Portugal, or for example, are going to make it difficult for people to get through border control in the Algarve or Lisbon or wherever. I think the implications for other sectors, I mean, for hauliers and so on, are serious. For the City of London, financial services, they're potentially serious, because all that has to be sorted out. In terms of the impact on people travelling to the continent, one of the fears previously about Brexit was if you were travelling on Eurotunnel or taking a ferry or whatever, you wouldn't be able to access it post Brexit because of the queues of trucks on the motorway leading down to Dover, and you'd be waiting for days and so on. Well, that's not going to happen, is it? On January the 1st, there aren't going to be vast numbers of people heading to France or returning from France to go for holidays. So, we can forget about that, really.
And then I think just, from an operational perspective, I think, there were and still are concerns around how, some of the industry will cope in terms of labor availability. If you go into, especially in London, into most hotels, most restaurants, the workforce there is not from the UK, and so on. So I think, that will put some pressure on operational performance by introducing potentially additional costs. And then, of course, if there's friction that's introduced in terms of bringing goods into the UK, those will get passed on to the customer. So expectations around seeing price of goods increasing is certainly a concern. I think the other aspect from a travel perspective is, if there's a material impact on the FX rate between the pound and, let's say, the euro, there's, as people start traveling again and they head out of the UK to the south of Spain for their summer holiday, and suddenly everything's 10, 15, 20% more expensive, will that impact their travel behavior? So I think, it's clearly not as far up the public agenda list at the moment, given what's happening with COVID. But the issues around Brexit that people were talking about pre-pandemic have not gone away.
And we've spoken about the pandemic, Brexit, environmental concerns. And we've also talked about our own staycations this year, although, Ian, yours unfortunately seem to have been cancelled. Do you think there's an opportunity here for the UK market?
I think the short answer is yeah, absolutely. We saw a trend towards staycations during the global financial crisis. And one of the key things that I hear, just even listening to my team as they've gone out on these staycations, they come back and they go, I never knew the UK was, that beautiful, that brilliant, and so on. And, people always go, oh, the weather's not great and so on. There's fantastic opportunities to travel around the UK to see different things. And I think, that is what the industry is very much focused on, is putting its best foot forward, because the reality is the first segments to come back will be leisure and it will be domestic, right? And so on. So that the focus needs to be on capturing that demand, and there's plenty of opportunity to do that. I think there's some fantastic product around the UK, fantastic destination. So as we emerge again from lockdown, I very much hope that I can agree with Ian to say that people will travel again. They will look to book in that January-February window, and I'd expect a increased element of that will be domestic.
Yeah, I have to agree with Andreas on that. The only thing is I cannot bear the term staycation. It implies people staying at home, not going anywhere. It's a dreadful marketeer's term, and it makes me, it's like nails down a blackboard for me.
Although I will say that one of our pod squad team did actually go camping in her own living room. So I think that is definitely classed as a staycation.
Okay, that would normally count, but it's normally kids that do that kind of thing. But look, it's we talk about it like it's something new. Last year there were 47 million outbound holidays from Britain, and 58 million holidays and short breaks in Britain taken domestically. So, it outnumbers the international market. I wanted to disagree with Andreas on something as well before we finish.
Go on then, come on.
Which was what he talked about, travel being a right and essential and so on. International travel in any year, in a good year, not a crisis year, not a immediately post the global financial crisis year, between maximum 45% of the adult population travel overseas in any year. So more than half the population don't travel overseas in any year. So, it's an activity of a large minority. And if you ask how many people travel abroad more than twice a year, you're getting down close to, 14% or something like that. So it's a minority who enjoy that level of international travel.
Yeah, I think I'm one of that minority, and but I mean, from a personal perspective, I love travel. I've always travelled. I've lived abroad many times, and it's sort of part of my makeup. I lived abroad as a child, and it's just something I love. But I have to say, at the moment, I just feel very privileged that I've had the opportunity to travel, and right now I'm very comfortable with not. You mentioned earlier about this, people feeling they have this right to travel. I personally don't feel that way at the moment. I had a lovely holiday in Yorkshire in August. To your point, Andreas, there's, on a sunny day, there's nowhere like Britain.
And Ian, you mentioned that less than half the people in the country enjoy international travel or get the opportunity to have international travel. I mean, I'm sure that's a choice in some cases, and in others it's probably they don't have the means. Is there a fear that with everything that's happened with COVID and upcoming Brexit, that it will become more and more concentrated an activity for the wealthy?
Well, I think there will be financial implications for households. People aren't going to be better off after this. People on furlough and most people in work have taken pay cuts this year. So, there's that aspect. There'll be the overhang of debt that people and businesses will have implications. The cost of all the protocols, testing, all the rest of it, right throughout the system will have to be borne by someone, and it will be by consumers, because who else is going to bear it? So prices, I think the initial recovery will be price driven, despite the bit of research that I quoted earlier, because the likes of Ryanair and Wizz will, once they put capacity back on, they'll want to fill the seats. In the medium term, prices will rise across the board. I think that's inevitable, and that's before you start adding in the cost of dealing with climate impacts and so on.
So let's just sort of a few final thoughts before we close today. Can we imagine a future without travel? And as hard as it's been, is COVID-19 the perspective that we need for better travel going forward?
Yes and no. It's not going to be the same for some time. That's for sure. Some really big businesses in the travel industry are going to be smaller for the medium to long term. So, Europe's biggest airline group, Lufthansa Group, expects to have 100 fewer aircraft operating in 2024 than it did at the start of this year. So that's a big impact. If you think back to 9/11, which isn't a comparable crisis in lots of ways, except in the impact it has on the travel experience, if you like, and over several years from 2000 and late 2001 through 2006, 2007, there was the liquids restrictions had to come in. There was the shoe bomber, if you remember, and all that. The experience of going through an airport and entering some hotels in the world where they had scanners and so on changed significantly, became a bit more of a faff, and it remains a bit of a faff, but largely the systems everywhere adjusted. It's fairly routine everywhere you go in the world, and the numbers who travel has just continued to rise 4% year on year, pretty much every year, except for the financial crisis and its impact. So there was an adjustment, and that's what we'll see with the COVID. I think by the time we have routine testing and vaccines available, I do foresee a change for a lot of destinations in the world, the destinations we think of as long haul from the UK. I mean, the economies with the sorts of money available that has been available in the UK will adjust, but India won't adjust. It doesn't look like Brazil is going to adjust. I can foresee lots of countries in Latin America and Southeast Asia and elsewhere in the world not adjusting, and COVID becoming seasonally endemic and therefore having an impact on travel. And COVID will become one of the vaccinations you have to have before you travel to destinations, which of course will have an impact on some travellers.
And Andreas, if I take the final question of the episode, which is, of course, will travel ever be the same again? What would be your answer to that?
Will it ever be the same again? No, I think it, as I said earlier, it will evolve. But I don't think we are going to see quite as an extreme of a shift as some people are envisioning now. I think there's a lot of talk about, fundamental structural changes in the industry. And as we, come through this pandemic and out the other side, I think there will be some noticeable changes. But I think it's also important to remember some of these changes will be positive, right? And I'll give you an example of a thing that I view as highly positive. It's when I go into a pub nowadays, I've traveled to the pub. I used to have to get into the scrum at the bar and elbow and try and make eye contact with one of the bartenders and so on. Now I sit down at a table, I scan a QR code, I punch a couple of buttons, and a pint of, whatever I fancy shows up delivered with a smile, right? And to me, that is a tiny, tiny operational change, which probably should have happened, years and years ago. And everybody I talk to go, yeah, I like having that option. I still want to be able to go to the bar. And certainly those much younger than me love going to the bar because it's a way of socializing and interacting. But a lot of times I just want to scan a QR code, order my pint of lager, and get it delivered to my table, right? So there will be lots of little changes like that will stick around, that will be positive, that improve the experience and so on. It's just difficult to see them and feel them right now because the impact, the negative impact of the pandemic is so overwhelming. But we'll get through this, and people will travel again, and they will enjoy traveling again, and they will travel again in large numbers. I'm convinced of that.
Sorry, I find that deeply depressing. Ordering a beer by QR code. I want to sit at the bar, Andreas.
I am very pleased to finish this on a positive note, and a big thank you to Andreas, yourself, and Ian for joining us today. A really interesting discussion. I'm going to leave this podcast and go and look at my next holiday options. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And once again, thank you.
Thanks, both, for coming in.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of The Green Room by Deloitte. We'll be back next time with another big question. This podcast is produced by our very own pod squad and hosted by George Parrott, Lizzie Elston and Ethan Worth. Thanks to our creative studio for their technical support. Original music by Ali Barrett from our consulting team.